Nobody remembers the name of the man who first saw him. History did not consider it worth recording. He was a lookout, probably cold, probably exhausted, probably still running on the adrenaline of the last few days of combat, scanning the surface of the Atlantic for survivors who were increasingly unlikely to still be alive. And then he saw it. Something dark, something small, something that moved in a way that did not match the movement of wreckage. He would have told himself it was impossible before he told anyone else, because the human brain does that. It tries to protect you from statements that make you sound insane. Then he told someone anyway, and the destroyer changed course. And they pulled a cat out of the North Atlantic, covered in oil, shaking with cold, alive in defiance of every physical law that governs the survival of small, warm-blooded creatures in water at 4 degrees Celsius. What the lookout felt in that moment, we will never know, but I suspect it was the particular feeling that only impossible things produce. Not quite joy, not quite disbelief, but a trembling somewhere between the two. The feeling of the universe briefly showing you its other face. This is the story of a cat. I want to be precise about that from the beginning, because there is a version of this story that turns the cat into a metaphor so quickly that it forgets to be a story about an actual living creature with white paws and a black coat, and an appetite and opinions and a specific, documented way of responding to catastrophe that tells us something true about what it means to be alive in the middle of a war. The cat was real. His oil-soaked fur was real. The piece of wood he clung to was real. The cold water that should have killed him was real. We are going to stay inside that reality, because the reality is more interesting than any metaphor that could be constructed from it. And then, when we have done that, when we have actually been inside the specific texture of what happened, we will discover that the metaphor was there all along. It always is. The best stories do not need to announce their meaning. They just tell you what happened, and the meaning walks in through the door on its own. Let us begin at the beginning. Not the dramatic beginning in the Atlantic Ocean, though we will return there. The real beginning, the quiet beginning, the one that looks like nothing until you understand what is coming. 1941. A German naval base. A battleship being made ready for the most ambitious operation the Kriegsmarine has ever attempted. The Bismarck is 50,000 tons of the most advanced naval engineering in the world. A vessel that represents the absolute pinnacle of what human beings in this period can do when they decide to build something designed to kill other things efficiently. 8 guns of 380 millimeters. Armor plating that can stop almost any shell that exists. A range that threatens every convoy route, keeping Britain in the war. She is, by the calculations of her builders, effectively invincible. And somewhere inside her, living in the spaces between the technology and the firepower, doing a job that has been done on ships since the ancient Egyptians first put cats aboard their Nile trading vessels, is a small black and white cat whose name in German we will never know. Ship's cats are one of the longest continuously maintained traditions in naval history. The reasoning is entirely unsentimental. Ships carry food. Food attracts rats. Rats eat food, contaminate provisions, gnaw through electrical cables and wooden structural elements, spread disease through a closed population living in close quarters with no access to medical help beyond what the ship carries. A single breeding pair of rats can produce a population of several hundred animals within a few months. A good cat eliminates this problem at a fraction of the cost of any other solution, requires no maintenance beyond feeding with scraps that would otherwise be discarded, and as a bonus effect, tends to do something to the psychological atmosphere of a ship that is difficult to quantify, but has been recognized by mariners for 3,000 years. There is something about the presence of a small animal going about its business with complete indifference to the concerns of the humans around it, that functions as a kind of pressure valve on the emotional atmosphere of a crew under stress. We do not fully understand why this works, but it works. It has always worked. Every navy in the world has known it for centuries. So the Bismarck had her cat. He was good at his job. He was healthy. Well fed on galley scraps, comfortable in the labyrinthine lower decks of the ship, familiar with every corridor and hatchway and warm exhaust duct in his territory. The sailors liked him in the way that sailors have always liked ship's cats, with a particular mixture of genuine affection and superstitious regard that is specific to men who live on the ocean. The sea is the largest thing in the world. It is also the most indifferent. It does not care about rank or skill or bravery or the quality of your weapon systems. It will kill you with the same flat efficiency, whether you are a 20-year-old conscript on your first voyage or a 30-year admiral with a chest full of medals. Men who spend their lives surrounded by that indifference develop certain habits of mind. They become alert to signs and omens. They carry talismans. They believe, without necessarily being able to articulate why they believe, that luck is a real property of certain objects and certain living things. And that proximity to those things can transfer that property to you. A cat that has survived difficult situations is therefore not merely a pleasant animal to have aboard. He is a reservoir of survival that you can borrow from. The cat on the Bismarck had not yet survived anything difficult. He was just a cat. But he was about to receive the education of his life, delivered in the harshest possible manner, over the shortest possible time. In May of 1941, Operation Rheinübung began. The Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen left port and headed north, threading through the Denmark Strait, attempting to reach the open Atlantic, where the German High Command believed the Bismarck could single-handedly cripple the Allied convoy system. The British were not going to allow this. The moment the Bismarck was spotted, everything in the Royal Navy that could be brought to bear was directed toward one objective: find her, sink her, do not let her reach the Atlantic. What followed was one of the most dramatic naval pursuits in history, a chase across hundreds of miles of freezing ocean that would end with the pride of the German fleet at the bottom of the sea. But before the end, there was the Battle of the Denmark Strait, and the Battle of the Denmark Strait contained a moment that changed the character of everything that followed. The British sent their own flagship to intercept. HMS Hood, the most famous warship in the Royal Navy, the ship that had represented British naval power to the world for 2 decades, the ship that every British person had grown up knowing as the symbol of their country's mastery of the sea. She was over 40,000 tons and carried 8 15-inch guns and was crewed by over 1,400 men. She and the Bismarck exchanged fire at extreme range. It lasted a few minutes. A Bismarck shell found the Hood's magazine. The explosion was total and instantaneous. The Hood ceased to exist as a ship. She became, in the space of a single breath, a column of fire, and then a field of debris on the surface of an ocean that had already closed over her keel. 1,415 men, 3 survivors. The shockwave from that explosion traveled through every ship in the Royal Navy, and through every person in Britain who heard the news on the wireless. The invincible ship was gone, and the thing that had sunk her was still afloat, still running, still heading for the Atlantic. Everything that the Royal Navy could find was sent after the Bismarck. The pursuit was relentless, expensive, and ultimately successful. On the evening of May 26th, torpedo bombers from the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal found her through terrible weather. Most of their weapons missed, but one torpedo, in a piece of misfortune for the Germans that bordered on the cosmically unjust, struck the Bismarck's stern at precisely the angle required to jam her rudder in a turned position. She could no longer steer. The fastest, most powerful battleship in the world was now sailing in a slow circle in the middle of the Atlantic, unable to run, unable to maneuver, able only to fight and die in place. The British fleet arrived at dawn. The bombardment that followed lasted over an hour. More than 2,800 shells were fired at the Bismarck before her own crew opened the sea valves and scuttled her, rather than let her be taken. She went under at 10:40 on the morning of May 27th, 1941. She took most of her crew with her. Out of 2,200 men, 114 survived, and somewhere in the water, somewhere in the field of wreckage that spread across miles of Atlantic, a cat was floating on a piece of broken deck. The water was 4 degrees Celsius. The oil that covered everything, that coated his fur and burned his eyes, was toxic. The waves were the size of buildings. Nothing this small should have been alive. Nothing this small should have been able to stay alive. The cold alone should have been enough. At 4 degrees, the physiological cascade that ends in hypothermic death begins almost immediately in a small animal. The core temperature drops. The muscles begin to fail. The heart slows. The mind dims. The grip loosens. And then you go under. And the water is suddenly everywhere. And that is the end. Except that for this particular cat, on this particular piece of wood, in this particular moment, it was not the end. He held on. Whatever kept him holding on, whether it was pure biological stubbornness or something else, something that the rational mind cannot name without feeling slightly embarrassed by the naming, he held on for long enough. Long enough for the destroyer HMS Cossack to come close enough for someone to see him. Long enough to be pulled from the water still breathing. Long enough for the story to continue. Think about what the sailors of the Cossack saw when they pulled him aboard. They had just fought one of the most intense engagements of the war. They had watched the Hood die. They had spent days at action stations, running on adrenaline and bad sleep, doing the thing that naval training makes you able to do, which is to keep functioning at high efficiency, while a significant portion of your brain is quietly processing the fact that you might die at any moment. And now they were looking at a cat, a small, black and white, thoroughly oil-soaked, visibly traumatized but unmistakably alive cat, wrapped in a rescue net, being lifted onto their deck. There is a quality to moments like this that does not translate well to historical narrative. The deflation of it, the sheer absurd normalcy of a living creature needing to be dried off and given warm milk, in the middle of all the scale and violence of what had just happened. The men who stood there on the deck of the Cossack, looking at this impossible little survivor, felt something shift inside them. Not a dramatic shift, not a transformation, just a small, quiet loosening of something that had been pulled very tight for a very long time. They named him Oscar. The letter O in the International Maritime Signal Code is represented by the Oscar flag and means man overboard. It was the kind of joke that people make when they need to make a joke, but do not have the energy for a funny one. It was also, in its way, perfect. This cat was literally a man overboard by the broadest possible definition of the term. He was a survivor of the worst kind of naval disaster, floating in the water where men die. And now he was aboard, and he was alive, and they were going to keep him. Not because of any regulation or official policy, because there was no regulation or official policy covering this situation. They were going to keep him because something in them needed to. Because in the economy of feeling that governs what humans need in order to keep functioning under extreme and prolonged stress, Oscar represented something that had no equivalent and could not be substituted. He represented the persistence of ordinary life. He represented the possibility that small, warm, living things could survive the unsurvivable. He represented, without knowing it or caring about it, hope. And hope in 1941 in the North Atlantic was not an abundant resource. The officers of the Cossack were not happy. This is important to understand, because the officers were not wrong. They were operating a warship in a combat zone, and warships in combat zones run on a logic that is entirely operational. Every resource has a cost. Every distraction has a consequence. The space taken up by a cat is space that could be taken up by something useful. The food fed to a cat is food that could feed a sailor. The time spent by sailors caring for an animal is time that could be spent maintaining weapons systems. The argument for removing Oscar from the ship was entirely rational, and the officers who made it were not cruel or heartless. They were focused, which is what they needed to be. But the ordinary sailors, the men who actually lived the day-to-day reality of service on that destroyer, who slept in the hammocks and ate in the messes and stood the watches, they argued back. They argued back in the particular way of men who are technically subordinate, but know something that their superiors do not know, which is what it feels like from the inside when the morale of a crew is working and when it is not. A crew that is functioning, that has some small piece of the world to care about beyond its immediate survival, fights better and endures longer than a crew that has been stripped of everything soft. The sailors knew this. They could not necessarily articulate it, but they knew it, and they fought for their cat. The compromise that was reached was characteristically British in its practical informality. Oscar could stay. He would not be official. He would not be in any report. He would catch rats, stay out of the way during action, and cause no problems that would require the officers to admit they had made a mistake in allowing him aboard. The crew agreed enthusiastically. Oscar, who had no stake in these negotiations and no opinion about their outcome, simply began the process of learning the Cossack the same way he had learned the Bismarck. Warm corners first, food sources second, routes between the two. He had been a ship's cat his entire life. He knew how this worked. He settled in with the pragmatic adaptability that is either the most admirable or the most enviable quality of cats, depending on how you look at it. What developed between Oscar and the crew of the Cossack over the months that followed is something that requires careful description, if it is going to be understood rather than merely sentimentalized. It was not simply affection, though there was affection. It was not simply superstition, though there was that too. It was something more functional than either of those things. Sailors serving on a destroyer in the Battle of the Atlantic in 1941 were under a sustained level of psychological pressure that the civilian world has almost no equivalent for. They lived in permanent proximity to death, not the abstract death that most people carry as a background awareness, but the specific, concrete, always possible death of a torpedo through the hull at 3 a.m, a depth charge detonating a fraction too close, a mine, a shell, an aircraft. They could not leave. They could not take a break. They could not go somewhere quiet and process what they were experiencing. They lived inside the experience continuously, sleeping and eating and working and standing watch inside the same steel structure that was also the thing that might kill them. The psychological burden of this is not something that training fully prepares you for, because nothing fully prepares you for the specific texture of your own sustained fear. You carry it. You carry it all the time. And sometimes, in the middle of carrying it, what you need is not analysis or strategy or leadership or any of the tools that the institutional structures provide. Sometimes, what you need is a small, warm, indifferent animal in your lap. Oscar performed this function with consistent excellence. He did not judge. He did not advise. He did not require anything more of the men who sat with him in the quiet hours than that they sit with him. He purred, or he did not purr. He shifted his weight, or he did not. He occasionally bit the hand that scratched him, which is a very specific kind of emotional honesty that humans often cannot afford to deploy, but cats can. Men who could not talk to their crewmates about what they were feeling, because the culture of a warship does not make room for that kind of conversation, could sit with Oscar and say whatever they needed to say into the particular listening silence that cats provide. This is not a small thing. This is in the vocabulary of what keeps human beings functional under extreme conditions, a significant thing. The officers noticed, eventually, that the ship ran better when Oscar was happy. They did not record this observation, but they stopped arguing about leaving him at port. Then, October of 1941 arrived, and with it, the convoy HG-75. The Cossack was on escort duty, 600 miles west of Gibraltar, 4 a.m, clouds over the water and no moon. The German submarine U-563 had been tracking the convoy for hours with the patient geometry of a predator that knows it does not need to rush. She fired a single torpedo, electric propulsion, no wake, no warning, The weapon covered the distance between submarine and destroyer in approximately 40 seconds. It struck the Cossack's port side beneath the forward gun mounting. The detonation was not an explosion in the ordinary sense of the word. It was a structural event, a reorganization of matter at the point of impact, the sudden conversion of solid naval architecture into gas and heat, and fragments traveling in all directions simultaneously. The forward section of the ship was destroyed. Men sleeping in those compartments did not wake up. The rest of the ship heaved and screamed and listed forward as the ocean began to fill the spaces the blast had opened. Inside the hull, below the waterline, where the warm ducts ran and the engine noise was a constant presence, Oscar woke to a world that was wrong in every dimension. The angles were wrong, the sounds were wrong, the smell was wrong. Saltwater where saltwater should not be. The sharp chemical smell of damage, the change in air pressure that accompanies a hull breach. He had no conceptual framework for what was happening. He did not know the word torpedo. He did not know the geopolitical context that had placed a German submarine in these particular coordinates at this particular moment. He knew that his world had inverted and that the path upward toward air and light and away from the rising water was the only path that mattered. He moved. He had done this before, though he had no conscious memory of having done it before, only the body memory, the deep inscribed pattern. Move up, move away from water, find light. He moved through the tilting corridors with the specific, purposeful urgency of an animal operating entirely on instinct, and his instincts were very good. The crew fought to save their ship for hours. The damage control teams sealed what could be sealed, pumped what could be pumped, reinforced what could be reinforced. They kept the Cossack afloat when she should have sunk immediately. They bought time. But the wound was too large, the flooding too persistent, the structure too compromised. Other ships of the escort formed a screen around the crippled destroyer. Tugs were dispatched from Gibraltar. The plan was towing, repair, survival. It did not work. The damage was too extensive. The list increased. The waterline moved. After 12 hours of fighting for a ship they had lived on and loved, the crew was ordered to abandon. 159 men had died. The rest prepared to leave. And Oscar, by some means that the historical record does not specify with confidence, found himself among the survivors. Wet, unhappy, alive. Word had spread through the fleet about the cat who had survived the Bismarck. The story had moved. Through the convoy system, the way stories do, carried by sailors who saw each other in port, scrawled in letters home, passed between ships over radio during the long, tedious hours of escort duty. So when Oscar arrived among the survivors of the Cossack, the men who received him knew his story. They knew he had been floating in the Atlantic in May, after the greatest naval battle of the war. They knew he had survived, and now he had survived a second ship. The mood this created was complex. Some men felt the superstition shift from positive to negative. 2 ships had sunk with this animal aboard. 2. The mathematics of survival were unclear. Was Oscar protection, or was he something else? Was his survival a blessing transferred to those around him, or was his survival achieved at the cost of the ships he had inhabited? The debate was real and genuine, and conducted with the particular intensity of people trying to impose meaning on events that resist it. It was also, in the key end, irrelevant to what happened next. The Admiralty, in the way of large institutions that have access to information unavailable to individuals, saw the strategic value in the story of the surviving cat before most people had formulated the full picture. A cat had survived the Bismarck. A cat had now survived the Cossack. The cat would be transferred to HMS Ark Royal, the aircraft carrier, the specific ship whose torpedo bombers had crippled the Bismarck. The specific ship that could, with a certain poetic justice, be described as the reason Oscar existed as a story at all, since, without those swordfish finding that rudder, The Bismarck escapes. There is no sinking. There is no cat floating in the wreckage. There is no rescue. There is no Oscar. The decision to send Oscar to the Ark Royal was either brilliant irony or pure administrative coincidence. The records do not clarify which. The Ark Royal was enormous, 1,600 crew, a flight deck 600 feet long, hangars, full of aircraft. The operational complexity of a small city combined with the particular atmosphere of a ship from which men launch themselves into the air every day in machines that are trying very hard to kill them. The pilots found Oscar immediately and with enthusiasm. There is a quality of understanding between people who survive dangerous things repeatedly and animals who do the same. Not a rational understanding, not a shared language. Something more physical than language, a recognition at the level of the nervous system, a perception of the specific quality that distinguishes an animal that has been through extremity from one that has not. The pilots petted him before missions. They brought him portions of their food. They spoke to him the way people speak to things they trust, with information they cannot give anyone else. Oscar accepted all of this with the same steady equanimity he brought to everything, and it seemed for a few weeks that he had finally found a stable situation, that the pattern of disaster was behind him, that the universe had used up its supply of catastrophe in his direction. The universe had not. On November 13th, 1941, 30 miles from Gibraltar, the Ark Royal was struck by a single torpedo from the German submarine U-81, 30 miles from port, in clear weather on a routine return trip. The torpedo struck the starboard side. The blast was significant, but not immediately fatal. The Ark Royal was large, well-built, heavily compartmentalized. Her damage control teams were among the best in the fleet. They went to work with impressive speed and skill, and for several hours the situation was genuinely uncertain. She might be saved, or she might not, and no one could tell from inside the effort which way it would go. Tugs came from Gibraltar. The towing began. The distance was 30 miles. It might as well have been 1,000. The flooding did not stop. The list increased. The pumps fell behind. The hull temperature rose in the damaged sections. The lights went to emergency power. The deck angle reached 25 degrees, and at 25 degrees, the hangar became a carnival of expensive debris, aircraft breaking their lashings and crashing into each other in the dim emergency light. After more than 12 hours, the order was given. Abandon ship. The abandonment of the Ark Royal was orderly in a way that the destruction of the Bismarck had not been, and in a way that the damage to the Cossack had only partially been. There was time. There was time to organize. There was time to bring personal belongings. There was time to account for the crew, and there was time to look for the cat. Sailors searched through the listing corridors of the dying carrier, calling Oscar's name, checking the corners he had claimed as his own in the weeks he had been aboard. They found him in the account that has been passed down on one of the motor launches. He had navigated there himself, through a ship listing at 25 degrees, through corridors where nothing was level and everything loose was sliding, through the noise of a structural failure happening in slow motion around him. He had found his way to the boat that was going to float. When the sailors lifted him out, when they looked at his face, what they reported seeing was not fear. It was not the panicked, desperate face of an animal in the grip of terror. It was something else, something that looked, to the sailors who saw it and recorded it afterward, remarkably like anger. Not the wild, unfocused anger of pain, the specific, pointed, compressed anger of an animal who has been through this before, who recognizes this situation, who is very tired of being in this situation, and who is making it clear with every muscle in his face that he considers his current circumstances to be an unreasonable imposition on what should by any fair accounting be a stable and comfortable life. That expression matters. It matters more than it might seem to. Consider what anger means in the context of survival. Fear and anger are both responses to threat. but they produce very different physiological states and very different behaviors. Fear contracts. It narrows the focus, reduces the scope of action, can, in extreme cases, produce paralysis. Anger expands. It mobilizes. It generates movement and decisive action. The cat who floated in the Atlantic after the Bismarck was operating on pure terror, the stripped-down survival instinct of an animal with nothing left but the grip on the wood. The cat who found the motor launch on the Ark Royal was operating on something more developed than that. He was angry. His anger moved him through the sinking ship toward the only sensible destination. His anger kept him functional when fear might have frozen him. If Oscar learned anything from his 3 disasters, it was not patience or resignation or acceptance. It was the conversion of terror into directed irritation, and directed irritation turned out to be, in practical survival terms, significantly more useful. 1 man died in the sinking of the Ark Royal. 1 out of 1,600. It was a remarkable number, a testament to the professionalism of the Royal Navy, to the 12 hours of warning the slow sinking provided, to the discipline and training of the crew. It was also 1 too many, because war does not deal in moral satisfactions. The rest of the crew were brought ashore at Gibraltar. Oscar was among them. And in Gibraltar, the decision was made that would determine the shape of the rest of his life. The Admiral